On January 29, 2025, President Donald Trump signed the Laken Riley Act into law, marking a pivotal moment in U.S. immigration policy. Named after Laken Riley, a Georgia nursing student tragically killed by an undocumented migrant, the act introduces stringent measures for the detention and deportation of unauthorized immigrants accused or charged with specific crimes including burglary, theft, and assault. Legislative background and political context. The Laken Riley Act represents the first major piece of legislation signed by Trump in his new term, demonstrating his administration's commitment to strict immigration control. The act was passed by a Republican-controlled Congress with some bipartisan support from Democrats, indicative of a shifting political landscape on immigration, a traditionally divisive issue. Trump framed the law as a necessary step to protect American lives, stating, "It's going to save countless innocent American lives." He highlighted the personal impact of Laken Riley's case during the signing ceremony, expressing condolences to her family and asserting that her name would be remembered in U.S. law. The act expands the criteria for immediate detention and deportation, allowing state attorneys general to sue federal officials if an undocumented immigrant commits a crime. Critics have raised concerns that this provision could undermine due process and grant excessive power to state officials, potentially leading to politically motivated actions against immigrants. The funding freeze and subsequent legal challenges. In conjunction with the signing of the Laken Riley Act, Trump's administration experienced a tumultuous period surrounding a freeze on $2 billion in federal funds previously allocated for various programs. The funding freeze was part of Trump's strategy to align federal expenditures with his political agenda, particularly targeting initiatives he deemed woke or aligned with diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. The abrupt freeze created chaos, disrupting essential services like Medicaid, and was met with backlash from various states. A federal judge in Washington, D.C. temporarily blocked the funding freeze, siding with a coalition of attorneys general from 22 states and the District of Columbia, who argued that the order violated federal law. Timeline of events. January 28, 2025, Trump ordered the freeze on federal funding, leading to confusion among state and local agencies. January 29, 2025, Trump signed the Laken Riley Act into law, emphasizing its importance for public safety. On the same day, a federal judge temporarily blocked the funding freeze, allowing essential services to resume. Implications of the Laken Riley Act. The Laken Riley Act is seen as a cornerstone of Trump's immigration policy, reinforcing his administration's tough stance on unauthorized immigration. With the law in effect, unauthorized immigrants arrested for specific crimes will face immediate detention, raising concerns among advocates about the potential violation of their due process rights. The provision allowing state attorneys general to sue federal officials for crimes committed by undocumented immigrants could lead to a patchwork of enforcement policies, where states with more conservative leadership might adopt harsher measures against immigrants. Responses from political actors and advocacy groups. Responses to the signing of the Laken Riley Act and the funding freeze varied across the political spectrum. While Trump and his supporters praised the legislation as a necessary step toward securing the borders, critics, including immigration advocates, expressed alarm over its potential to infringe on civil liberties and due process rights. Democrats, who had previously struggled with a unified approach to immigration, found themselves in a challenging position. Some party members supported the act, reflecting a shift in public sentiment towards stricter immigration enforcement following electoral losses attributed to perceptions of weak immigration policies. Conclusion. The signing of the Laken Riley Act and the simultaneous funding freeze highlights a critical moment in Trump's presidency, showcasing a significant shift in U.S. immigration policy and federal funding priorities. The interplay between strict immigration reform and budgetary decisions underscores the administration's focus on enforcing its political agenda while navigating legal challenges and public backlash. As the implications of the Laken Riley Act unfold, the ongoing debates about immigration, public safety, and civil rights will likely shape the political landscape leading into the upcoming elections, further complicating an already contentious issue in American politics. The content reveals several counterintuitive pieces of information, particularly regarding the implications of the Laken Riley Act and the funding freeze initiated by Trump's administration. 1. Bipartisan support for immigration reform. While immigration is often viewed as a divisive issue, the passage of the Laken Riley Act with some Democratic support suggests a shifting political landscape. Historically, Democrats have been seen as more lenient towards immigration policies, but the need to respond to voter concerns about crime and immigration may have led some Democrats to align with Trump's stricter measures, indicating a pragmatic approach to governance over strict party lines. 2. Perception of immigrants as criminals. The narrative surrounding the legislation emphasizes immigrants' criminality, which is a common trope in political discourse. However, studies show that immigrants as a demographic are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. This presents a counterintuitive situation where political rhetoric does not align with statistical realities, suggesting that the fears around crime involving undocumented immigrants might be exaggerated or misrepresented. 3. Federal funding freeze and its consequences. The abrupt halt of $2 billion in federal funds aimed at woke initiatives was presented as a move to ensure governmental spending aligns with Trump's political agenda. Yet the immediate chaos caused by this freeze, impacting essential services like Medicaid and prompting legal challenges, highlights the unintended consequences of such politically motivated actions. Despite the intention to streamline and enforce ideological conformity in federal spending, the actions created significant disruption in services that many Americans rely on, suggesting that political goals can sometimes lead to detrimental outcomes for constituents. 4. A judicial intervention. The temporary judicial block on the funding freeze illustrates the checks and balances inherent in the U.S. political system. While the executive branch can enact sweeping changes, the judiciary serves as a counterbalance, often stepping in when actions are perceived as overreaching or unconstitutional. This dynamic can be counterintuitive in the context of a strong executive push for policy changes, as the expected unopposed implementation of the president's agenda can be thwarted by judicial review. 5. Public perception of federal employees. The Trump administration's offer to federal employees to resign with pay until September was positioned as a necessary step to streamline government operations. However, this move was met with skepticism and fear among federal workers and unions, who saw it as a potential trap that could lead to job losses without the promised benefits. This perception contrasts sharply with the intended message of efficiency and reform, illustrating a disconnect between administrative objectives and employee trust. 6. The Venezuelan migrants and humanitarian concerns. The revocation of protections for Venezuelan migrants stands in stark contrast to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela itself. While the Trump administration's actions seem aligned with strict immigration policies, they also disregard the dire circumstances that many migrants face. This juxtaposition raises ethical questions about prioritizing political ideology over humanitarian needs, which can be counterintuitive for a nation that historically positions itself as a refuge for those in crisis. 7. Impact on essential services versus political goals. The chaos resulting from the funding freeze, which affected essential services like healthcare, housing, and education, contrasts sharply with the administration's stated goals of eliminating waste and promoting conservative values. The disruption to services, particularly in states led by Republicans, indicates that political strategies may undermine the very systems they aim to protect or reform, showcasing a potential disconnect between ideological goals and practical governance. 8. Public trust in crime rates. The assertion that stricter immigration laws will lead to a decrease in crime rates is often used to justify such legislation. However, studies historically point to the fact that crime rates do not correlate with immigration levels. This disconnect suggests that public fears about immigration and crime may be more influenced by political rhetoric than by factual evidence challenging the rationale behind policies like the Laken Riley Act. These counterintuitive points highlight the complexities of the political landscape, where actions taken for ideological reasons can lead to unintended consequences that challenge the very narratives they seek to promote. The report on President Donald Trump's recent signing of the Laken Riley Act and the resumption of federal funding presents several critical points that many people may overlook. Yet their significance cannot be overstated. 1. Bipartisan support for immigration reform. One of the most striking aspects of the Laken Riley Act is its bipartisan support, as it received backing from some Democratic lawmakers. This shift indicates a changing political landscape regarding immigration, a historically polarizing issue. Many may dismiss this bipartisan cooperation as a mere anomaly, but it suggests a potential re-evaluation of immigration policy that could lead to significant legislative changes in the future. The willingness of Democrats to support stricter immigration measures reflects growing public concern over crime and immigration, which could reshape the party's stance and strategy in upcoming elections. 2. Empowerment of state attorneys general. The provision allowing state attorneys general to sue federal officials if undocumented immigrants commit crimes poses a significant shift in the balance of power between state and federal authorities. Critics argue this could undermine due process rights. But the broader implication is the potential for increased state-level intervention in federal immigration policy. This could lead to a patchwork of enforcement approaches across the country, resulting in inconsistencies in how immigration laws are applied and potentially escalating tensions between states and the federal government. 3. Impact on due process rights. The Act's requirement for detention based on mere accusations or charges rather than convictions raises serious concerns about due process rights for immigrants. While critics have highlighted this, many people may overlook how this could set a precedent for broader civil liberties erosion. If similar standards are adopted in other areas of law enforcement, it could lead to a significant shift in how rights are granted and protected in the U.S., affecting not just immigrants but potentially all citizens. 4. Federal funding resumption. The resumption of $2 billion in federal funds, which had been frozen, is framed as a corrective measure following a chaotic funding freeze. However, the underlying agenda to align funding with Trump's political priorities, particularly targeting woke initiatives, indicates a broader effort to reshape federal spending to reflect specific ideological beliefs. This could have long-term implications for various social programs, especially those related to healthcare, education, and social services, as funding may be contingent upon compliance with the administration's agenda. 5. Consequences of the funding freeze. The immediate chaos caused by the funding freeze, which impacted essential services like Medicaid, highlights the fragility of government operations in the face of political maneuvering. Many people may underestimate the ripple effects of such freezes on local communities and vulnerable populations. The disruption of services, particularly in healthcare and social support, underscores the potential human cost of political decisions, drawing attention to the interconnectedness of federal funding and local welfare. 6. Political strategy in future elections. The interplay between immigration reform and funding decisions illustrates a broader political strategy aimed at galvanizing Trump's base while appealing to moderate voters concerned about crime and immigration. This dual approach could be significant in shaping the narrative leading into future elections, as it positions the Trump administration as both tough on crime and responsive to fiscal responsibility. Understanding this strategy is crucial for voters who wish to grasp the complexities of contemporary political dynamics. 7. Judicial oversight and constitutional balance. The temporary legal block imposed by a federal judge on the funding freeze serves as a reminder of the judiciary's role in checking executive power. Many may overlook the significance of judicial intervention in maintaining constitutional balances, especially as executive actions increasingly encroach on legislative authority. This incident could set a precedent for future conflicts between state and federal powers, particularly regarding funding and policy implementation. 8. Cultural and ideological implications. The framing of the federal funding freeze as a means to combat woke ideologies signals a cultural battle that transcends mere policy differences. This ideological warfare could exacerbate societal divisions, leading to more polarized public discourse. The emphasis on cultural values in political strategy may mobilize certain voter bases but also risks alienating others, potentially reshaping the demographic landscape in future elections. 9. Potential for increased militarization of immigration enforcement. The use of military facilities for detaining undocumented migrants as allowed under the new legislation raises concerns about the militarization of immigration enforcement. This development may go unnoticed by many who view it as a technical adjustment. But it signifies a troubling trend towards utilizing military resources in domestic law enforcement, which could have far-reaching implications for civil liberties and community relations. 10. Long-term effects on immigrant communities. The Act's implementation may lead to a chilling effect on immigrant communities, fostering fear and reluctance to seek legal assistance or report crimes. While the immediate focus may be on the law's provisions, the psychological impact on communities could undermine trust in law enforcement and government institutions, perpetuating cycles of marginalization and vulnerability. In conclusion, the report on the Laken Riley Act and the resumption of federal funding highlights critical elements that extend beyond the immediate political implications. Understanding these overlooked aspects is vital for grasping the broader societal, legal, and cultural shifts at play, which will likely resonate for years to come. The actions taken by the Trump administration represent not just policy changes but potential transformations in the fabric of American governance and civil rights. 1. The Laken Riley Act and its implications for immigration policy. The signing of the Laken Riley Act represents a critical shift in U.S. immigration policy, mandating the detention of unauthorized immigrants accused or charged with specific crimes. Named after Laken Riley, a victim of a crime committed by an undocumented migrant, the legislation underscores the emotional and political narratives surrounding immigration. It expands the criteria for immediate detention and gives state attorneys general new powers to sue federal officials if undocumented immigrants commit crimes. Critics argue this could lead to violations of due process rights and empower state officials to influence federal immigration policy, which traditionally has been a federal responsibility. The bipartisan support for the act suggests a significant shift in political alliances and attitudes toward immigration, indicating that immigration reform may become a more central issue in the upcoming electoral cycle. 2. Resumption of federal funding and political ramifications. The Trump administration's decision to resume $2 billion in federal funding previously frozen comes amidst legal challenges and public outcry regarding the abrupt funding freeze. The funding freeze was intended to audit expenditures that aligned with Trump's political agenda, particularly those he deemed woke or related to diversity and inclusion initiatives. The chaos caused by the freeze, which impacted essential services like Medicaid, highlights the interconnectedness of federal funding and public services. The temporary legal block by a federal judge emphasizes the contentious relationship between the executive branch and the judiciary, particularly in matters impacting state and local governance. This situation reveals the potential for significant political and social ramifications as Democrats rally against the funding cuts, framing them as detrimental to vulnerable communities. 3. Due process concerns and the role of state attorneys general. The legal implications of the Laken Riley Act raise significant concerns regarding due process for undocumented immigrants. By allowing state attorneys general to sue federal officials for crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, the act could lead to a patchwork of enforcement across the country. Critics argue this undermines the uniform application of immigration law and may lead to discriminatory practices. This provision also reflects a growing trend of state-level intervention in federal immigration matters, raising constitutional questions about the separation of powers and the role of states in enforcing federal law. The potential for increased litigation and the subsequent burden on federal resources further complicate the already contentious immigration landscape. For bipartisan support in shifting political landscapes. The bipartisan support for the Laken Riley Act indicates a notable shift in the political landscape surrounding immigration. Traditionally a polarizing issue, the fact that some Democrats backed the legislation suggests a recalibration of party positions, possibly influenced by electoral pressures and public sentiment regarding crime and immigration. This shift may signal a broader trend of Democrats reassessing their stance on immigration in response to Republican narratives that frame immigration as a threat to public safety. As immigration emerges as a key political issue, the implications for future electoral strategies and legislative agendas become critical, potentially reshaping party dynamics and voter alignments in the years to come. These points encapsulate the critical shifts in U.S. immigration policy and federal funding under the Trump administration, reflecting broader societal debates about immigration governance and civil rights. They offer a foundation for in-depth analysis and discussion on the implications of these legislative changes and the evolving political landscape. 1. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was the first significant law restricting immigration to the United States aimed specifically at Chinese laborers. The act prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming U.S. citizens and effectively barred their entry into the country for 10 years. This act was a response to economic concerns and racial prejudice similar to contemporary debates around immigration and crime. The act was renewed and expanded multiple times, reflecting a shift in U.S. policy that prioritized certain groups over others based on nationality and perceived threat. 2. Operation Wetback 1954. This was a U.S. immigration enforcement initiative aimed at deporting undocumented Mexican immigrants. The program involved mass roundups and deportations, often conducted with little regard for due process. The operation was driven by fears of illegal immigration and economic concerns paralleling modern-day policies that emphasize crime-related deportation of undocumented immigrants. It demonstrated a significant shift in immigration policy towards aggressive enforcement similar to the measures introduced in the Laken Riley Act. 3. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. This legislation aimed to curb illegal immigration by imposing penalties on employers who hired unauthorized workers while also providing a pathway to legal status for certain undocumented immigrants who met specific criteria. While intended to balance enforcement with compassion, it ultimately led to increased deportations and stricter immigration controls over the following decades. The act reflects ongoing tensions in U.S. immigration policy where efforts to balance enforcement with humane treatment of immigrants are often contentious, similar to current debates surrounding the Laken Riley Act. The signing of the Laken Riley Act by President Donald Trump on January 29, 2025 represents a critical shift in U.S. immigration policy and reflects broader political trends that may shape the future of American governance. As we consider the implications of this legislation and the concurrent resumption of $2 billion in federal funding, several predictions about the future can be made. Immigration policy and enforcement. 1. Increased detention and deportation rates, with the Laken Riley Act mandating the detention of unauthorized immigrants accused of specific crimes. We can expect a significant increase in both the number of deportations and the overall enforcement of immigration laws. This will likely lead to heightened tensions in communities with large immigrant populations and could result in legal challenges regarding due process rights. 2. State influence in immigration enforcement. The provision allowing state attorneys general to sue federal officials if an undocumented immigrant commits a crime will empower states to play a more significant role in immigration enforcement. This could lead to a patchwork of policies where states with more aggressive immigration stances may implement stricter enforcement than others, causing inconsistencies and potential legal conflicts. 3. Shift in political alliances. The bipartisan support for the Laken Riley Act suggests a potential realignment of political alliances, particularly regarding immigration issues. The Democratic Party may increasingly find itself in a defensive position on immigration, which could lead to a re-evaluation of its policies as it attempts to regain trust among voters concerned about crime and safety. Federal funding and governance. For ongoing legal and political battles, the temporary legal block on Trump's funding freeze indicates that the administration will face significant pushback from various states and advocacy groups. As lawsuits progress, there may be a prolonged period of uncertainty regarding the funding of essential services, particularly in healthcare, education, and emergency services. This could create a political battleground as Democrats and their allies seek to capitalize on the negative impacts of funding cuts. 5. Increased federal control over state policies. The resumption of federal funding under tightly controlled conditions may lead to increased federal oversight over state programs. States that have relied on federal funding may be forced to align their policies more closely with the federal agenda, particularly regarding conservative social policies. This could provoke backlash from liberal states and further entrench partisan divides. Social and economic consequences. 6. Impact on vulnerable populations. The resumption of funding is likely to be accompanied by cuts to programs associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. These changes could disproportionately affect marginalized communities, leading to increased poverty and social unrest. We may see a rise in advocacy and protests as affected groups mobilize against perceived injustices. 7. Long-term economic effects. The funding freeze's chaotic implementation has already created significant disruptions to services like Medicaid and public education. If not resolved quickly, this could lead to long-term economic consequences, including job losses in sectors dependent on federal funding and increased reliance on state and local resources to fill the gaps. Political landscape and future elections. 8. Energized voter bases. Trump's actions could galvanize both his supporters and his opponents. Supporters may feel energized by the aggressive approach to immigration and federal funding cuts, leading to increased turnout in future elections. Conversely, the backlash from those affected by the funding freeze and immigration policies may mobilize anti-Trump sentiment, potentially driving higher voter turnout among Democrats and independents. 9. 2026 midterm elections. The political landscape heading into the 2026 midterm elections will likely be shaped significantly by the outcomes of the legal battles surrounding the Laken Riley Act and the funding freeze. If the Trump administration's policies result in adverse impacts on communities, Democrats may position themselves as champions of public services and immigrant rights, aiming to reclaim control in Congress. 10. Potential for more legislative changes. Depending on the political climate and public response to the Laken Riley Act, further legislative initiatives to modify immigration policy may emerge. If the act leads to significant public outcry or challenges, it could result in a bipartisan effort to reform immigration laws more comprehensively, possibly leading to a more humane approach to immigration and deportation. Conclusion. The implications of the Laken Riley Act and the associated funding decisions are profound and multifaceted. As we move into the future, we can expect increased polarization in U.S. politics, heightened enforcement of immigration laws, and significant challenges for vulnerable populations. The political landscape will likely continue to evolve as both parties respond to the consequences of these policies, shaping the direction of American governance in the years to come.